So let's talk about Badeie and Fiedler's The Would-Be Technocracy. This is a bit of a tricky article to address because when you come to the end of it, there is a small criticism there, but it doesn't feel like there's a lot of substance to that criticism. The first half, or actually more than half of the article, is a bit of a literature review, although some of it is scattered. And in the tail end, they kind of start to make, I think, the basis of an argument. But in the end, it feels like it's an argument that that never really connects because they don't have the evidence to actually show the negative. And so this I'm making an abstract set of comments about an abstract article. So why are we looking at this? Well, unlike the Galloway piece, they really are trying to. They also recognize the importance of protocols. They recognize that the formation of internet TCP/IP internet protocols are essential to protecting not just privacy, which they've started to incorporate, but also to protecting human rights more generally. And they're responding to an effort through an RFC, which is again that, and I encourage you to take a look at the RFC, which I think is 8280, right? I don't have it on hand, but I think that's the RFC. All the RFCs are available online. You can search for them and find them. And their concern is that this effort to include human rights approaches to the formation of the protocols is not unfounded. It's not something that, it's something that is needed. We need to have the protocols in some sense incorporate these general ideas, right? But they think that it is misguided in that you can't just tell folks that they have to now include something that they haven't included in the past. You basically can't expect internet engineers to suddenly become political scientists along the way. And you can't expect them to effectively represent the constituents, for want of a better word, the users. This question of technocracy versus more democratic control is, as they argue, something that is long-standing. They kind of hit on many of the people that we've probably read or at least touched on or read people who have talked about, going all the way back to Weber and to Veblen and to Lewis Mumford and a number of other folks who have sociologists and urban planners and others who have looked at this question of the degree to which technologists should have control over the development of technology versus the degree to which the users of those technologies should have some control over that process. Keeping it very brief, as I said, I think that the overall lit review is a bit scattered here. On the one hand, I agree with the things that they're citing, but I don't think they actually craft this into a really clear discussion that says, okay, this is the basis for our decision base here. And I think that there's a bit of a switch that happens. If you'll notice, they start by talking about the IETF and the development of TCP/IP and some of the other protocols that are developed by the IETF. But once they start to talk about a historical development and the evidence to draw off of, they switch to the DNS system and who is. Now, especially if you're not familiar with these ideas for how the internet actually works, I want to encourage you to get familiar with those basics. You don't have to become a network engineer yourself, but you definitely have to understand how, the basics of how the DNS system works, about how packet switching works, about the development of the internet, and how the protocol stack works, right? How each of these protocols kind of is built on the one before it. But as Galloway touches on, and now we have it here as well, TCP/IP is the thing that is, if not distributed, at least it is multicentric or decentered. It is this system that allows for the internet itself to route around problems. It is resilient instead of efficient. And then there's other protocols that are built on top of that can allow for things like video streaming. Like the internet was never designed for video streaming. So you have to have protocols that overcome its kind of cumbersome, distributed, non-centralized nature, so that you can do things like stream data over the internet. As Galloway notes, the most central force kind of on the internet is the DNS system. This is kind of the internet's phone book, right? It's how you use domain names to find things, usually over the internet, over the web, but also through other internet protocols as well. So they kind of do this switch where they start with talking about the IETF and the development of the internet protocols, but then switch to the development of DNS. And again, DNS is this authoritarian. That's not really fair. It is this more centralized system of control. And as Galloway noted, the root servers really do, if you could shut down, if you have control over the root servers, and there aren't that many of them, especially early on in the time period that both these guys are writing in, but especially early on, if you have control over the root servers, you basically can make the internet work the way you want it to. Now, if we had a failure of the DNS system, we could probably think of an even more distributed system that would not rely on those root servers. But it is ultimately this question of ownership. And this article talks about this period from 1985 to 1995, right? 85 is where you start to get domain names. And I remember when someone at Wired Magazine registered McDonald's.com, right? At the time, you didn't have to pay. Early on, you did not have to pay for registrations. Later on, Network Solutions charged like $50 for registering a domain. This is before we got to the point where, GoDaddy was advertising at the Super Bowl that you could get whatever it is, $5 domains or whatever they were trying to sell people for. But at the time, it was kind of a technocratic process, right? You would send, I remember getting my first domain, and you would send an email, basically send an email to someone saying, I'd like this domain. And they'd say, okay, here it is. And then that was before you had kind of the onslaught where everybody wanted a domain, and they started charging more and more for it. This period, they note that the commercialization of the internet in 1995 really starts to inflect a lot of this. But the truth is that and that's where they note the first mentions of internet governance start to come in. But the reason those mentions of internet governance come in is because up until that point, there was an effort by the U.S. government, to control the global domain name system. Yes, we developed kind of a series of structures that allowed for the control of this. But early on, a lot of them were run by directors of the intelligence agencies in the United States. That sounds kind of, foreboding, I suppose, and it was, right? Especially if you're not in the United States. The idea that the people in charge of distributing these names were part of the U.S. military or intelligence services is disturbing, right? But you have to remember that DARPA was directly involved in the development of the internet. So, especially before we hit this huge commercialization move in the mid 1990s, it's weird that the military rather than academics are in charge of the DNS system, because again, IETF is yes, certainly representatives of the companies that provide internet services, but also a lot of academics. They would go and meet in San Diego, and people would come down from UCLA or UC Berkeley, and lots of faculty and engineers that were working in those spaces. And so that side of it felt very, university-like, while the DNS system seemed to be more directly under the control of the U.S. government. And so there was this effort to try to democratize this, where people could be elected to serve, or where you had representatives from around the world. So that there was this kind of distribution of control over the domain name system over time, so that it wasn't purely controlled by the U.S. government. But they picked this really weird case, right? They picked the most extreme case of I don't even know that you would call that technopoly, because, these aren't necessarily technocrats. They are, but they're also sort of part of the command and control system of the United States. They are part of the military and intelligence services in the U.S. And that's probably the most extreme case of sort of political authority rather than technical authority. And so it's a weird case for them to choose. And yes, they're right. It is really hard to do a history of that because nobody will give you a straight answer about those decisions, because a lot of the things were not done in public. A lot of the decisions were not made in public, and probably not very well documented as well. That's not true, frankly, of the IETF to the same degree, at least. Although some of the discussions may not have been well documented, there is a documentation record that can be kind of gone over historically. You don't have the same thing on the DNS side. So they've picked a weird case here. I happen to agree with their general conclusion, and their general conclusion is, given the broader political context, you can't expect engineers to make political choices. You can't expect engineers to incorporate democratic processes. You need to have some other mechanism for doing that, so that this idea of just doing an RFC to fix it, technological fixes are not the same as representative fixes. Context matters a great deal. And so I think I agree with their general conclusion. I just don't think they've made the argument well, which is that, the absence of evidence does not constitute an argument. And they've picked a particular subsection of the protocols issues that is most likely to not have a historical evidence for how it's developed. So that's, I think that's probably the weakness of the article. I think the strength is to recognize again this question of not just protocol, but the meta piece, the protocols for making protocols, and this idea that maybe you can't engineer those in the way that you expect, that they're too contingent, they change too much over time, that you need something other than a clear bureaucracy for making those protocols. You need something that is perhaps more participatory and more representative. All right, thank you.